Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Q4, Week 1, Day 1. I'm glad to be able to be talking to you right now. Things obviously are a little bit unusual, but we are just going to do our best and forge ahead. Now, what we're talking about today is delineating an argument. For this assignment, we are going to be using the text, "Is survival selfish?" We had actually started this text before school let out, so you may have a paper copy of it if you brought it home with you. That's great if you do. If you don't, there is a PDF copy in Google Classroom under classwork, under the topic Unit 5, Quarter 4. Now, I do have a side note. If you have your notebook, actually, even if you don't have your notebook, you should be writing this down, taking notes just like you would be doing if we were in class. It's not terribly long, but that process of writing notes down helps encode information into your brain. That's why we do it. That's not going to be any different at home than it is at school. It's always going to help you. So even if you don't have your notebook, just use a piece of paper or something. You could transfer it back into your notebook when you get back to school, assuming we do get back to school. If not, again, just the process of writing it down is really going to help you. So delineating an argument, an overview. The word delineate literally means to outline in detail, like you were looking at it, like to make a really accurate picture of something is just what to delineate means. So to delineate an argument is to examine in detail a handful of things. First, what argument is an author making? Like, what's their claim? What's their thesis? Generally speaking, claim and thesis are going to be pretty interchangeable. There are some subtle differences that you may run into as you progress through 10th, 11th, 12th grade. For our purposes, we can just say that claim and thesis are basically identical. Anytime you see claim, you can read thesis and vice versa. So don't worry about that. So the first thing we're looking for is, what argument is an author making? What are they trying to prove? What are they trying to convince you of? And also, how are they making that argument? What evidence are they providing? How do they use that evidence to support their claim? These terms should sound pretty familiar. This is just tiers in reverse, right? When you're writing something, you have a thesis, an introduction, an evidence, a response, and a summary. Same thing with this. You are looking for what this author is presenting as their thesis. What's their introduction? Where are they getting their information? What information are they giving you? And how are they using their reasoning to connect that evidence and use it to support their thesis? We're not really worried about the S part of that in this process, but same thing that you do when you're writing, you're just doing that in reverse. You are, in a sense, grading what somebody else has written according to the standards that you are being graded on, right? Does their thesis make sense? Is it something that they can prove? Have they provided evidence? Have they demonstrated that their evidence does in fact support their thesis? And if the argument hasn't done all of those things, then all of a sudden we have a problem. So here's kind of the process of doing that. First thing you have to do, obviously, read the entire text. You are not even starting the process of delineating an argument until you've read the whole thing. Let me say it again. You're not starting the process of delineating an argument until you have read the entire text, that you've gone through and done your decoder voice, right? You know all the vocabulary words, that you are pretty sure that you understand all the words that this author is saying. This can just be a skim, just like we do in class, right? You're not reading for detail the first time through. You're kind of going over it as an overview, trying to get a rough shape of what you think this author is trying to say. Generally, where do you think they're going with their argument? And again, vocabulary and figures of speech and all of those things. We want to make sure that we're set on all that stuff before we start the whole process of delineating an argument. Step number 2, go through that text paragraph by paragraph. And we're actually going to do that together in just a few minutes, paragraph by paragraph for the first few, and then you're going to do the other ones on your own. So for each paragraph, you've got 2 things that you're going to be trying to do. The first thing is you want to summarize the paragraph, including the evidence. So you're going to take that paragraph and boil it down into 1, maybe 2 sentences if it's really long and you really feel like you need to do that. But your goal should be to try to get it down to 1 sentence. So for the example of is survival selfish, we're starting with 15 paragraphs. We're trying to get that down to 15 sentences. Why? Why is that important? Well, it's important because the process of summarizing something is going to force you to really kind of tear apart the paragraph and look for those key things. What's the author's thesis? What evidence are they offering? And how are they providing reasoning to connect that to the thesis? So you're going to summarize the paragraph. And then this part is a little bit strange. As I said, when you finish your skim read, that first initial read, you are going to have an idea, or you should have an idea, as to what you think the thesis is. Don't get stuck on that. Don't be absolutely sure that you know what the thesis is. You want to have kind of a functioning idea, and that's good, but it's okay, and it should be a little bit wobbly. It should be a little bit amorphous. You should be willing to change what you think the author's thesis is depending on what you're about to read in your more detailed read through. That first read through was just a skim. So you're not looking for all of the nuance of argument. You're just trying to get an idea as to the general shape of it. So if you're reading through this second time and you find something, you find a detail that you missed, you realize maybe that the author has said something that you didn't think they said, or didn't say something that you thought they said, that's fine. That's fine. That's why we do multiple reads. It's totally okay. But you just need to hold in your mind that what you think the thesis is might change as you go through the process of this delineation, okay? So I'm going to demonstrate this process using the first few paragraphs of Is Survival Selfish? Okay, so the first thing we need to do is kind of come up with our preliminary thesis. Again, if you haven't read this whole thing, you need to stop this recording and go back and do that. You need to do your decoder read first, because this assumes that you've already done that. I know some of you already did it in class. If you didn't, you need to do that now. So I will give you a second to pause and complete that task if you haven't already. All right, we're going to move on. I'll assume that you have already read the whole thing. If you haven't, all right, well, I mean, you know, you're sort of responsible to do that, and it's your loss. Anyways, so having read the whole thing, what we see is, what do I think his thesis is? This is just kind of a preliminary. I think his thesis is that no, survival isn't selfish. It's a little bit weird. He never comes right out and says that. This isn't an academic essay. He's not explicitly trying to prove this point, but I think if you look at kind of what he's inferring, what he's assuming you think, and what he's kind of saying about what society thinks, the fact that he's even proposing an alternate viewpoint to that, I think demonstrates that he kind of leans in this direction, that no, survival isn't selfish. So I'll give you a second to read this paragraph on your own. Okay, let's begin. So in this paragraph, it is his first paragraph, but he doesn't really make mention of his thesis at all. He doesn't give you any sort of opinion on this whatsoever. This is just a story that he is reporting. So it's this story about J. Bruce Ismay. You might be saying like, hey, shouldn't he have his thesis in the first paragraph? We always have our thesis in the first paragraph. Well, yes, you do, because you're mostly doing academic writing. This isn't academic writing. The rules are a little bit different. This is more of like an op-ed piece for a magazine or a newspaper or something like that. He's not laying out a formal thesis. So we kind of have to read between the lines. We have to see kind of what is he saying without really saying it. But even looking for that in this first paragraph, we don't see a whole lot. There's just this story. The key part is these last handful of sentences here where he says his reputation was ruined, he was labeled an uncivilized coward, and a year after the disaster, he resigned his position at White Star. That's sort of leading into the thing that he's going to be discussing, this idea of, is survival selfish? So, summary, we're saying as a society, we look down on people that save themselves when other people die. And you might say, hey, wait a minute, that doesn't say anything about J. Bruce Ismay. That's true, because we're just summarizing. Because the point of him telling us this story about J. Bruce Ismay is not about J. Bruce Ismay himself specifically. What we're trying to figure out is, what is this author trying to illustrate to us? What information, what idea is the author trying to get across to us by telling us this story about J. Bruce Ismay? The dude himself, J. Bruce Ismay, is kind of immaterial to the point. What the author is trying to get across to us is this idea: as a society, we look down on people that save themselves when other people die. The story of J. Bruce Ismay is evidence that he uses to make this point. Okay, don't kind of get confused. The story is just evidence. We have to infer, we have to see what is he saying without saying it, are our ideas for the summary here. So here's paragraph 2. You can pause and read for a second. Okay, this is where the author kind of lays out their thesis. So we've already said, as a society, we look down on people that praise themselves or save themselves, and praise people who risk or sacrifice themselves. We didn't get that from the first paragraph. So we're adding on a little bit to that thing from the first paragraph. If we wanted to be really efficient, we could maybe just say the author adds on to the point from the previous paragraph and continues that we praise people who risk or sacrifice themselves. Just out of a sense of completeness, I put the whole thing down. Evidence. None. You may look at a paragraph and say, this paragraph doesn't have any evidence. The author hasn't said anything, or the author hasn't provided any external information. They haven't given me any facts or anything that I didn't already have. They're just commenting. That's okay. Every paragraph isn't necessarily going to have evidence. And if we look at this one, it doesn't, right? He says the women and children first protocol of the Titanic may not be as strong a social stricture. That's not evidence. That's just some commentary. And then they make this statement about lauding those who risk themselves and criticizing or looking less kindly on those who focus on saving themselves. But again, there's no evidence in that paragraph. Don't worry about it if you don't think there is any. Paragraph 3. This is where I think I misspoke on the previous slide. Sorry. This is where we start to see our thesis. And it's a little bit unusual, as I said, because it's kind of an inferred thesis. The author never comes right out and says, like, oh no, survival isn't selfish. Sometimes it's a good idea. But if we take a look at the previous two paragraphs have said, oh, this is what we think of as a culture. As a society, we look down on people that save themselves, and we applaud and think very well of people who sacrifice themselves, even if they die in the attempt, sacrifice themselves to save other people. By asking these questions, is survival really selfish and uncivilized? Like, is it? Or is it smart? Is it going in to rescue others always heroic? Or is it sometimes stupid? The very fact that this author is asking these questions leads us to believe, maybe the author thinks that sometimes survival isn't selfish. Sometimes survival is smart. Now they say it's a complex question because there's a lot of factors, and that's what we call a rebuttal, right? The author's softening their argument a little bit, but again, the inferred thesis here is, no, it might not be smart to save people. So surviving is smart. And again, evidence, we don't have any evidence in this paragraph. They're making their point, but they're not providing anything external. Don't feel like you have to hunt for evidence and find a piece of evidence in every single paragraph. It won't necessarily have one. These paragraphs 4 and 5, generally we would do this paragraph by paragraph, but then when I went and I read them, I said these paragraphs really belong together. This author could have very easily made this one paragraph and it would have been fine because it is telling one story, it is encompassing one idea. And ultimately, that's really what a paragraph does. A paragraph encompasses an idea. They've chosen to split it into two. That's fine, but we're going to look at them together. So I'll give you a second to read it, and we'll continue. So the summary from all of this, and again, we are not summarizing the story that he told. We are looking at the story that he told and saying, what concept is the author trying to get across to us by telling us this story? So our summary is that people do not always do what's best for their own survival, even when there's an obvious course of action, right? Like if there is a bomb in Grand Central Station, you should be trying to leave Grand Central Station as quickly as possible, not sit around and take pictures on your camera. He says, theoretically, everybody there would have wanted to survive, but they weren't acting in a way that would have led to their actual survival, right? Even though there's a very obvious solution. And then the story, remember, is evidence. The story is not the point. The story is evidence that is leading us towards the point. So here we see the evidence. The author uses this story about the pipe to illustrate his point that people make bad decisions. So now we're in paragraph 5. And I'll give you a second to read. So the summary here is people's survival instincts don't always kick in. It's kind of in the first sentence. The second part of this where he talks about the guy who does survival training and you don't know who's going to hold it together, that's really, it's kind of an interesting, but frankly, it's immaterial. Like we don't really care about that. All that leads us to is like, oh, well, sometimes people don't survive and you don't really know who. It's totally separate to his point, right? It's not talking about whether survival is selfish or not. It's this a little aside. So as far as delineating an argument goes, not that it's bad, but when we're delineating an argument specifically, we can totally ignore this. It doesn't matter. So if we take a look at this, this is the last paragraph that we are going to do together. And when you go to Google Classroom, you'll see the assignment there. But so if we take a look at this paragraph, I'll give you a second to read it. So the author uses this paragraph to continue the idea that some people don't take the action that they should, but also they add in this idea that we feel like, just as human beings, we feel like we should save people even when we can't. You may have heard the term survivor's guilt, right? You made it out of a situation and other people didn't make it out. And somehow we feel as though that's our fault, right? Oh, I made it out. If I made it out, I should have helped other people, even when that is not necessarily possible. So we have a picture of this woman. There's nothing she could have done, right? She got out of the plane. She had to climb over people. By the time she gets out, like the plane's on fire, everybody dies. She made it out. They could have made it out had they chosen to, but they didn't. They were just freaking out, and so they didn't exit the plane. There's nothing she could have done, and yet she still feels guilty. So why she feels guilty is like a whole psychological, like go take a psychology class to try and understand that one. But what the author seems to be saying is that it's not necessarily that we look at the actions of somebody who sacrifices themselves and says like, yes, that was a great call. You totally should have done that. As much as we are reacting emotionally and saying, oh, I would have had guilt about that. Like I felt like I would have had to go back and try to save people, and that person maybe didn't. And so since I would have felt guilty in that situation, I'm going to kind of judge them for not doing not trying to save other people, regardless of whether they could have done it or not, right? So if we remember back to paragraph 1, J. Bruce Ismay, he says, there was nobody else there. I loaded all the women and children that I could get onto a boat. The boat was leaving the lifeboat was leaving the Titanic at that moment. There's nothing else I could have done. And so then and only then did I save myself. And people still were like, no, it doesn't matter. Other people died and you didn't. And so that's your fault somehow, which is totally illogical. But we have this concept somehow that it should be. And that's really what the author is dealing with. So as I said, that's the last paragraph we're going to do together. If you go back to Google Classroom, you will see it's in the form of a Google quiz or a Google form, I think. No, it's a Google quiz. And it asks you to go through the remaining paragraphs and do just like we've been doing. Provide a summary of what the author is saying in that paragraph, and if the author adds in any evidence, sorry I forgot to tick the evidence up there, but I did talk about it. If the author provides any evidence to support their point. Now, we're not doing analysis yet. Don't worry about trying to figure out like, oh, is it a good argument? Is it a bad argument? Do they really use good reasoning to connect their evidence to the thesis? We're not there yet. We're going to get there. But right now we are just laying out in a lot of detail what this author is saying. So we're done here. You can go to Google Classroom and complete that assignment on your own.